Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week's episode was a special one with Henry Winter, the best-known football writer in the English language. If you haven't already, go back and give it a listen.
Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. And today's episode is on Gareth Southgate, the England manager. Now, be warned, Mehreen and I differ on Southgate, so this podcast will be a fierce debate, kind of for and against.
An Oxford Union style proposition. Yours is that he is a very laudable, commendable figure, and I would say that there's absolutely nothing remarkable about this man.
I'm saying he's the man who tamed the impossible job. England managers used to leave it broken. Southgate has been England manager for 8 years and made it seem a bit of a doddle. He's also got closer than any other England manager of the last half century to winning anything. Now, one reason I like him is most footballers who become managers try to reproduce what they learned, but Southgate's done something more impressive. He's learned from everything in his playing days that was wrong on and off the field. So he's kind of defined himself against the faults of English football. He's also become, I would say, one of England's most admired leaders, one of Britain's most admired leaders even. He's always contrasted favourably with politicians, as we'll see again during this election campaign. But again, Mehreen thinks all this is nonsense. I'm going to say he's helped redefine our sense of Englishness. He's presented England as a more modest country, a country that is a normal country, that doesn't have manifest destiny to rule the world, a country that learns from others, and an ethnically mixed country, a kind country where everyone can have a place. So like Ancelotti and Klopp and other managers we've discussed on Heroes and Humans before, Southgate is a model of leader for people way beyond football. Now, he himself sometimes talks like an airport business book, and we're going to try and talk about what he does without falling into that trap.
Stick around to the end of the episode where we will conclude whether Gareth Southgate really is worthy of all the praise that Simon has just heaped on him. You can probably sense that I am sceptical, but I'm open to being convinced.
I think one issue underlying this episode is that both you and I are hyphenated Britons, people of immigrant origin who do not support the England team. And I have sort of come around a bit to England under Southgate. You have possibly as well for different reasons.
You are getting soft in your old years. But it's true, I have also become more amenable to this team, but for different reasons. So that's probably going to come out in the course of this episode as well.
Yeah, should one love England? Learn to love England.
It's like therapy for us.
Mehreen, talk us through the Gareth Southgate stats.
Sure, so he's 53, so what, a couple of years younger than you?
A year, less than a year.
Very similar in age to you, Simon. He played for Crystal Palace, Aston Villa and Middlesbrough, solidly in the sort of mid-ranging teams of the Premier League, hardly the fast lane. And the only things he won as a player in domestic football were 2 League Cups, so the cup that is now called the Carabao Cup. However, he was a bit of an England stalwart. He won 57 caps for the Three Lions. And, of course, his career-defining moment as a player was missing that penalty that put England out of the Euro 1996 semi-finals, which is my first actual real footballing memory. And as we know, it was all downhill from there for me and England. Southgate's first managerial job was with Middlesbrough, and he ended up getting relegated with them. Middlesbrough have actually never regained their status in top-flight football. Years later, he became England's under-21 manager, I think without little fuss. I didn't even realise for a long time.
I didn't know England had an under-21s team.
And then in 2016, he made the jump to become England's real manager, the manager of the senior team. Nobody expected much from Southgate. England were at rock bottom. These are the years in which they lost famously to Iceland. However, it was only up from there, of course. England then reached the semi-final of a World Cup in 2018. They got to the finals of Euro 2020, held in 2021 in Wembley. Also made another World Cup quarter-final in Qatar. And this summer, for the first time, I think, in both of our lifetimes, we think that England are close to being favourites to win a Euro Championship in Germany.
One footnote to those stats, the defeat to Iceland was not under Southgate. It just preceded him. It was under the great Roy Hodgson, and we will come to that moment later on.
Simon, tell us about where he grew up.
Southgate is from Crawley, which is a new town south of London.
Sadly, there's no accent that I can associate with Crawley, so we're not gonna attempt one. I can do South London, but it's more like a gangster one. So
yeah, no, he was very much not a gangster family. So Southgate is from the respectable top end of the working class or lower middle class. And this gets him into the great class divide in English football, where essentially the class struggle is between the lower working class and the upper working class. Southgate's father is a facilities manager at IBM, Clive. He's a very serious, respectable bloke, like Gareth himself. Clive had been given the chance to turn pro at Luton Town, but he saw football as an unstable profession, so he opted for IBM. Clive is an athlete on the side, is a javelin thrower, and the mum, Barbara, is a hurdler, and so the parents meet at an athletics meet. And then they set up this very stable family, reliable, hardworking people with old-fashioned values, sticklers for politeness. The granddad had been in the Royal Marines in the war, and the granddad and father would stand up if a woman entered the room. You did not wear a hat indoors. You did not swear. It was a very old-fashioned decency that the Southgates had. Civility, patriotism as well. Southgate loves the England team as a child. He writes about this in a wonderful little book that's kind of been forgotten, which he writes with a former teammate. It's a book called Woody and Nord. He's looking back towards the end of his playing career, and he talks about, as a child, singing the national anthem. When he joins the England team, he sings the national anthem. The Southgates really believe in England. Gareth gets 8 O-levels at school. O-levels, for our non-British listeners, is the exam that in those days British kids would do at age 16.
GCSEs.
Now GCSEs. The typical footballer of the Southgate era would have 0 O-levels or 1 in
physical education.
And so Southgate gets 8 O-levels, which is a huge disadvantage when he becomes an apprentice at the nearest club, Crystal Palace, where he is from the upper respectable working class, and most of the other kids are from the lower working class.
The blue-collar working class.
Or the not in work working class.
So how does he get on as this sort of lower middle class kid in a quite a working class environment in South London?
He's teased for his long words, for his very unfashionable clothes, and for his kind of protected upbringing. So in Crystal Palace, he's mocked for his lack of cool, the absence of girls or alcohol on his CV. But Ian Wright, who's a senior pro there, says when you saw him at 15, he looked like a professional. He's a very serious lad, and he has his head together. So he's on the outside. He's respected as a player, but not really as a person. But the harder lads teach him to drink. You're not allowed to play English football in those years if you can't drink. So he's given a tequila slammers experience on a foreign tour, which culminates in him vomiting all over the chairman Rod Nodes in a lift. Career tip, do not vomit over the chairman of your company in the lift. The next morning, Nodes has put his vomity clothes outside Southgate's hotel room for him to launder, which Southgate, being a good boy, does, and it's forgotten.
But that wins you quite a lot of brownie points for the boys, though.
Yeah.
That's like peak lad behaviour.
Yeah.
Chundering all over your boss.
Yes, and I think this establishes him as having passed the initiation rites.
Yeah, he's been hazed and now he's in.
He never becomes exactly a ladies' man, but when he hooks up with Alison, who works at a local Benetton shop, he obviously marries her immediately because Southgate is that kind of respectable bloke, and they are still married about 30 years later.
What is he like on the pitch as a player, Simon?
He's not the most skillful footballer, but he works, he learns, he gets into the Crystal Palace first team, can play midfield or centre-back, and at 22 he's already club captain, because he has his head screwed on right. Palace get relegated twice during his time there. Now, it's at Palace that he first encounters Stan Collymore, who'll become a really important figure in the kind of education of Gareth Southgate. Because, you remember Collymore as a footballer.
He's a maverick, very exciting to watch on the pitch, but you could tell that there was perhaps something a little bit unhinged about him. Hugely exciting player.
Very gifted striker, but then comes out with depression. He's one of the first footballers to say he's depressed. And I remember the coverage at the time, well, you're earning £1 million, you can't be depressed. This insane idea that your mental health is correlated fully with your salary. And Southgate gets really angry with him, I'm here all the time, I always perform, you're brilliantly gifted, why don't you? And Collymore annoys the hell out of him. Later they meet again at Villa. It's the same dynamic. Collymore at this point is in a clinic being treated for depression, so he only shows up on Fridays and then plays the next day, doesn't do well. And Southgate later reflects on all this and thinks, the guy had mental health issues. He was also dealing with racism. And I didn't understand that or show him any sympathy. And so I think looking back on his poor relationship with Collymore, he thinks, I was the one who failed. And I think he takes that into his managerial career of being much more aware that not everybody is Gareth Southgate. People come from different backgrounds, have different mental healths.
So he's learning empathy and the ability to understand the dynamics of a changing room where some are plagued by demons. And
I think he was always empathetic, but he becomes more sophisticated at understanding the backgrounds that other people come from. So he talks about, this is again from this wonderful book, Woody and Nord, that he wrote with his former teammate and best friend who ended up in the lower divisions. He talks about playing with Ugo Ehiogu, who was a black centre-back at Aston Villa, and learning a bit from him that, you know what, not everybody comes from your white background, and black people have different experiences in Britain. And impressively, he's open to learning and hearing that. He's interested. He says before he went to Palace, he'd never played with a black kid in a football team.
Yeah.
And I think what the Collymore learning experience shows is that Southgate can do negative learning. He can learn from the things that are wrong in English football. A lot of people come up and they say, well, we did it this way when I was a player, so I'm going to do it exactly the same. When I was a player, we drank whiskey on the team bus and the manager would give you a bollocking at half time and there was no interest in the pressure. So I'm going to replicate all that. That's the typical reaction of the old pro. And Southgate says, you know what, there was no mental health concern in my day, and that was wrong. So I'm going to go the other way. And that becomes the way he, I think, thinks himself into becoming a manager.
So Palace get relegated in 1995. And
Their second relegation in the Southgate era.
And then Southgate ends up at Villa. And this is where I remember him as a player. And this is also the first time you met him, Simon.
Yeah. So a magazine sends me up to Aston Villa, freezing morning in March 1996. And it was a computer game to be played between this nerd who was a computer game champion and Southgate. Southgate had, for some reason, agreed to do this, and I was going to write about it. So the nerd and Southgate play this computer game. The nerd wins. But after the computer game, you know, usually with footballers, they're quickly ushered out by the press officer. And in this case, Southgate just hangs around. We chat. I hadn't really heard of him before I'd been given the gig because he plays for Villa. He's just in the fringes of the England squad. I didn't really care about English football. And so I get to know him, and he's this very polite, curious boy with a large nose, very much the young South version of the Southgate we know now, very amiable. And Paul Barron, who was the goalkeeping coach, a very kind of Mehreen style figure, hyper fit, he hangs around. And at one point, this Villa goalkeeping coach, Paul Barron, he says, okay, I'm going to measure your body fat percentages.
Yours?
Mine and Southgate's. Southgate takes off his shirt, and Barron attaches what looked like electrodes to his body. And it turns out that only 9% of Southgate's
That's insane.
body is body fat. And I said, well, I'm glad I'm not that, creepily thin. I take off my shirt, and Barron just looks at my stomach, and he says, maybe we should just use the slap test. And I said, what's the slap test? Remember, I'm 26 at that age. I'm peak of my, physical prime. And Barron says, we slap you in the stomach and see how long it shakes.
That is such a violation. Oh, my God.
But Southgate is embarrassed.
Of course.
Southgate feels this is not the way
This is
to
not the way you treat the outsiders into the club.
So Southgate's still lying on the floor, attached to these electrodes measuring his body fat. And he says, Paul, this bloke has only come around to write an article. So Barron then attaches electrodes to me, and it turns out I'm 16% body fat.
That's very respectable.
It's respectable.
No.
And during the conversation, it turns out that he really wants to be a journalist. He really likes journalism.
Oh, wow.
And it's partly why he's hung around. And I'm at the Financial Times already then. And I said, look, Euro 96 is coming up. You'll probably be in the squad. Why don't you write a diary of Euro 96 and we'll publish it every week in the Financial Times? I'll go back and tell the bosses. They'll be delighted.
Great commission, yeah.
Of course, when I went back and told the bosses, they were all Gareth Who and yeah. So that summer, Southgate does go to the Euro. He doesn't write a diary in the Financial Times.
Imagine if you had it, though. God, what could have been?
But it was the highlight of his professional life. Euro 96 is the 1 month of his career where he's playing in a top team at the highest level. Because as you've said, Palace, Villa, Middlesbrough, his club career, slow lane. England do really well. They beat Holland 4-1.
This is the Football's Coming Home tournament.
There's been this song on the radio for a few weeks, Football's Coming Home, It's Coming Home. And suddenly the crowd at Wembley begin to sing it. I think this is the first time ever. And I'd seen Baddiel and Skinner because they were in the press box. They were sitting a few rows from me. So when the crowd begins to see this, I look over at them and they're standing up and they're just gazing at this full Wembley singing their song, and they're basking with this wonder in their eyes. This is the best moment of their professional
The football
lives.
literally comes home because the tournament is held in England.
Held in England and at Wembley. And Southgate is a really solid player. And so Southgate, in this very solid England central defence, does well. All good. Semi-final against Germany at home.
Big grudge match.
Yeah.
All the war parallels, it's all there.
So the biggest game on English soil in 30 years. It's the semi at Wembley. Southgate has a really solid game. It's 1-1. England probably should have won it. Darren Anderson just fails to get on a ball at the far post. And then it goes to penalties. And Southgate, when it goes to penalties, thinks, all right, well, I'm obviously not going to be involved because I've only ever taken one penalty in my life and it hit the post. So good on you, lads. You just win it on penalties. And then Terry Venables and Brian Robson, the coaching team, come up to him and say, Gareth, would you be okay to take penalty 6 if it comes to that? And Southgate goes, yeah, okay. And then Robson turns back and says, you have taken one before, right? And Southgate says, yeah. Not mentioning that I think it was in the second tier in what was then the first division and it hit the post. So he is not a penalty killer. And England's penalty takers are really good, but so are Germany. So all the first 10 takers of both teams score.
Top bins.
Yeah, very unlike England. England have actually had a cracking penalty series, except that Seaman in goal has not stopped any. So then it's number 6. This bloke is walking up and you're not quite sure who it is. And he puts down the ball, turns back, and then he hits this soft curler slightly to the German keeper Kupka's left.
It's a bad pin.
And Kupka stops it.
Yeah.
And Southgate sinks down, head in hands. And then I realised that's Gareth Southgate. That's sort of the bloke I met in spring in Birmingham. And I think, oh my God, poor bloke. This is the seminal moment of Southgate's career.
And it's a sudden death, right? So once you're in after penalty 5, if you don't score and the other team score, it's done.
Yeah, so then Andy Müller, the German, comes up and he obviously scores because he's a German. Yeah. So Germany in the final, England not. And the final is against the Czech Republic, who are a decent team, but I would fancy England to have won that at home. So essentially, Southgate's miss probably costs them their first, what would have been their only trophy since 1966.
Would you have supported England if they'd won that tournament?
No.
I might have,
Oh, that's desperate.
I don't know. I just feel like when I saw them lose and I was like, oh, these guys are a bunch of losers. Something switched in me.
Yeah, well, Southgate was a very likeable face of England. I mean, he was always a kind of decent
They're all
bloke.
like, when we mentioned Darren Anderson, these are completely inoffensive people. Even Alan Shearer at the time, Teddy Sheringham, Seaman.
I think this is where we get to one of the issues with Englishness that probably you and I both feel that I like the English in defeat.
Yeah, I love them when they lose.
They're funny about themselves. They're humble.
Self-deprecating, take the piss out of themselves.
Yeah, no nation could comment its own decline as magnificently and funnily as the English have the last 10 years. But in victory, there's this hubris. There's this, we're the greatest stuff, which is very...
It's all the Britannia rules the wave stuff, sort of that latent, I think, nostalgia for empire comes back.
Well, this feeling that we are the greatest country in the world, this hasn't been fully recognised, and look, we won a football match, and therefore we are. I find resurgent. I remember now, I'm having this recovered memory of seeing my parents just before the game. My parents both emigrated from South Africa, South African Jews who'd come to London. And I said, who will you support, Germany or England? And they said, yeah, Germany.
Wow.
Hardcore.
Same.
You or your parents?
My parents are not that into football as much as me, but we were not.
Well, nobody's into football as much as you.
Yeah, fair. But no, England was never hostility, but there was just the kind of thing that's not for us.
Yeah.
But I would argue that the other realm in which Brits are really good at taking the piss out of themselves is also politics. And there is a little political parallel at the end of this game where Gareth Southgate meets the then Prime Minister.
So I think from that night, the intertwining of Southgate and the Prime Minister as kind of opposites or potential twins, that's when it starts. So he's walking through an empty Wembley. He's devastated. And he's going up the stairs and he passes this bloke. And he glances and he thinks, that's John Major, the Prime Minister. And Southgate is devastated, so he just says hi, and he walks on. And then he hears somebody shouting, Gareth, Gareth!
That's more like Gareth!
Major runs after him and catches him and says, Gareth, you mustn't blame yourself for this. It's been an incredible tournament for the country. You will feel terrible for a while, but it was not your fault, which is beautiful.
So I think there was a big parallel between Southgate and Major. Yeah, both from South London, accidental leaders in some senses. They both take over from predecessors who were toxic in many ways. And so I think there are a lot of parallels between Major and Southgate. I think you might argue a bit later on that Southgate's more like a visionary and a pioneer like Blair, but I think he's more in the Major camp.
But I think Southgate does also have this English futurist side, like Tony Blair. So Southgate is both an English traditionalist and an English moderniser, which is an unusual and very fruitful combination.
Okay.
That evening at Wembley, after missing the penalty, Terry Venables, the England manager, is a very sort of likeable, charismatic guy. He quotes Nietzsche to Southgate and says, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger."
I thought that was a Kelly Clarkson lyric. Maybe she stole that from Nietzsche too.
Who knows? So I was quite impressed that in the England camp, there's a lot of Nietzschean banter going on. Who would have thought?
Top bants.
Yeah.
But Simon, he misses the penalty, but Southgate has not become a villain overnight, which is what perhaps we might have expected would have happened.
The way the tabloids work in Britain is that if you're considered a big star, you have to be dragged down. So when David Beckham is the scapegoat for England's elimination 2 years later at the World Cup, he becomes the villain. But Southgate is not a big star. He plays for Aston Villa. He represents a kind of middle Englishness. A comfortable family in a new town. He's white, and also he's a likable guy. And so there's a kind of sympathy for him. He's got this open, naive face, this big nose. His admission afterwards that he'd been sure he would score. Then the tabloids find his mother, who said, he told me he would whack it. He used to take penalties in the back garden. He told me if he ever took a big one, he would whack it. So he starts to personify this new idea of England, which is a post-imperial England that's okay with defeat.
But Simon, the penalty, despite the fact that he's not pilloried in the press, it basically haunts him for most of his playing career.
I think it's the most important thing that happens to him in football to this day. And he never really stopped thinking about that penalty. And one thing he realises, he'd been sent out on the mission unprepared. Like you're doing a parachute jump and they say, "Oh, we didn't explain to you how the parachute works, but here you go." England hadn't prepared for penalties, and afterwards, there's no attempt to help him deal with his feelings in any professional way. Glenn Hoddle, the next England manager, realises that Southgate is down and has become frightened of playing for England. Hoddle sends him to this faith healer, Eileen Drury, who's a mum of an old girlfriend of Hoddle's. Drury does this laying on of hands and talks about auras and all this stuff.
Tarot cards.
Maybe tarot.
Maybe.
I've never been treated by her myself. And Southgate's not wholly sceptical of this. He gives it a go, but that's the only help they give him. There's nothing else. But wherever he goes, for probably until he becomes England manager, people will point and say, "Look, there's the bloke who missed the penalty at Euro 96. And that bothers him.
I mean, but they're basically, the rest of his career is, there are no milestones, there are no landmarks, there are no memorable moments to overshadow the penalty. So he does have to live with it, I think, longer than perhaps, the average top-class footballer in his mid-20s who will then go on to do other stuff. But Southgate never really does as a player.
He never plays Champions League. He is never in the running to win the league or anything. Yeah, England is the peak of his career. And so the penalty is the worst moment. But he does feel, he comes through the experience and he feels it does make him stronger, as Nietzsche had predicted. He feels, I've been through the worst thing you can experience as a pro. I'm still here. And he doesn't really feel as much fear anymore. And we'll see that when he becomes England manager. He's the accidental England manager, but he says, you know what, I'm going to make quite big changes. And if you don't like it, fair enough, I don't really care because I'm not afraid.
So he's got a much higher pain threshold now.
He has a very high pain threshold because he's been through this awful thing. And maybe David Beckham is similar, although Beckham would never have the words to express it in the way that Southgate does.
Ouch.
And Southgate's club career is a disappointment. I mean, he's a really good player. He says in his book he feels he was the best centre-back in England. But he spends his prime years, 95 to 2001, at the wrong club, Aston Villa. And he's very frank about his disappointment with Villa. It's just not an ambitious club. Not all the players are trying to perform at top level. And Southgate always is. And I think this is where he gets his obsession with high performance that we see with England now. You create a high performance environment where everybody feels I have to be 100%, I have to measure myself against the best in the world. And this is an obsession with him because Villa was not that place. They were not really, they were a decent team with talented players. They weren't really trying to win the league.
They were just always mid-table, never get relegated, never really threatening for Europe.
Yeah, they were, I think they were top 10 team.
Yeah.
And they win the League Cup in 96, and that's all. Now, he wants to get away to a big, serious club. And there are transfer bids from Lazio, from Deportivo La Coruña, from Chelsea, but Villa don't let him go. Now, lots of players in that situation, they just force a move. They go on a kind of silent strike or they play tough through their agent. But Southgate's dad, Clive, says, look, son, you signed a 5-year contract. You gave them your word. You can't go back on your word. And this is the very honourable Southgate family who would never do anything that they regarded as at all indecent, like playing hardball to leave a club. So Southgate feels, well, there's nothing I can do. I promised that I would play for them. So he doesn't break with Villa. And he goes to the England team and he's always in the England squad. And there are these people that are playing for Manchester United, for Arsenal, and he feels that should have been me. It's something he never gets to experience as a player, and it's a lasting sadness.
And his playing career basically ends with a whimper. He does end up at Middlesbrough, where he would later manage, wins another League Cup, but England doesn't really work out. He gets injured in the World Cup in 1998. He's not really a fixture in Euro 2000, and then the World Cup in 2002, he's basically on the bench. So he's around the England squad, but he's never really at the front line. And then his final match as a pro is in 2006. It's the UEFA Cup final against Sevilla. So this is when your guy, Steve McLaren, honorary Dutchman, is manager. And Middlesbrough, despite all their lots of anticipation, they get battered 4-0.
And late in his career, he writes in his book that he's fallen out of love with football. He's cynical about players' behaviour, about how clubs treat players, about stupid fans ranting in phone-ins. And he finishes in his book, perhaps there's been a bit too much mediocrity in my football life over the last few years. As a kid, I thought the top of the game would be packed with unbelievable quality. Now I work with international players who have poor technique and a lack of focus. I love football, but I do not like the professional version. That's hard words.
And he's incredibly reflective for a footballer to have this level of insight and resentment at a game which you would say has treated him pretty well, at least materially.
Yeah, and he's played 57 times for England. He's not one of the game's losers.
No.
Yeah. He ends up at Middlesbrough, living in lovely, quiet, bourgeois Harrogate in Yorkshire, playing for the local cricket team, going for walks in the countryside, becoming an honorary Yorkshireman. He still lives there. Middlesbrough immediately make him manager as soon as he stops playing. And he's there for 3 seasons, not very glorious, and ending with Middlesbrough being relegated. And a few months later, Gareth is sacked. He's then out of football for 4 years. So you'd think, he had a brief managerial career, didn't really work out. It's over. He's obviously not going to be a manager again. And then in 2013, England make him manager of the under-21s. So from this unpromising post, this man with barely any managerial CV, relegated with Middlesbrough, becomes, in a moment of national desperation, England manager. How does that happen? And how does he reinvent the job?
Find out how after the break.
So, you want to be a marketer. It's easy. You just have to score a ton of leads and figure out a way to turn them all into customers. Plus, manage a dozen channels, write 1 million blogs, and launch 100 campaigns all at once. When that's done, simply make your socials go viral and bring in record profits. No sweat. Okay, fine. It's a lot of sweat. But with HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools, launching benchmark-breaking campaigns is easier than ever. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
This is a reminder that you're listening to the Heroes and Humans of Football podcast with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper.
Welcome back to Heroes and Humans, and we're about to discuss how Gareth Southgate becomes England manager. Simon, we've already mentioned it before, but there is a big humiliation before, which sets the ground for his appointment, and that is...
I would argue a hilarious humiliation.
Probably one of the funniest humiliations.
No, it is the funniest. I've been through the England eliminations. This is the funniest.
This is pretty funny. It says 2016, 4 days after the Brexit vote, England are playing Iceland.
300,000 people.
A nation of 300,000 people. Known for what? Being Vikings, fishermen, and having a catastrophic financial crisis.
Volcanoes.
Where all the fishermen became hedge fund managers.
And some of them bought West Ham United. Yeah.
That's
Great nation, Iceland. We both love it. Before each tournament, I always think, how are England going to get humiliated? And at Euro 2016, it was obvious they were going to beat Iceland and then play France in the quarters and go out on penalties. So they just have to get past Iceland and something goes wrong. They lose, and it's a really interesting defeat.
Are you there?
No, I was watching on TV. I thought I'll go to the France game because obviously they're going to beat Iceland. And it's one of those moments where you can see the team, as Iceland go up 2-1, you can see the England players start to visualise the tabloid headlines and the bashing they're going to take, and they get frightened and are infused with fear. And so very gifted players like the young Harry Kane, their game just falls apart totally, to the point where Kane takes an important free kick at one point. He just has to loft it into the box for someone to head it, and he can't even hit a free kick into the box. They're all paralysed by fear. They start pumping these long balls instead of playing it out to the wings. It's just, you see the damaging hubris that terrifies England players for decades and decades in this game. After this humiliation, manager Roy Hodgson has to go immediately. And the thing is that, importantly, Brexit has just happened.
Literally.
And Brexit, voted for by people like yourself, is partly a vote for
A return to
English
Britannia rules the
nationalism.
waves, which is obviously why I voted Brexit.
Yeah, well, you voted Brexit for other wrong reasons, but
Bespoke reasons.
the people who voted for Britannia rules the waves, they certainly didn't want another foreign England manager,
No.
was the feeling.
God forbid.
So not another...
Roy Hodgson was just a bit too European too. He was really not part
well, he
of
speaks
the,
Swedish, I think.
Yeah, not part of the post-Brexit Britain. He didn't fit very well.
Yeah, he reads Milan Kundera. He speaks Swedish and Italian, not good. Yeah. And so we can't have another overpaid Sven-Göran Eriksson, Fabio Capello figure. It has to be an Englishman. But who? The barrel is empty. So in the quest to find an Englishman, because of course it can't be a woman because women don't know anything about football, is the prevailing opinion.
That's true.
It also has to be a white person because obviously football managers have to be white, is the thinking. So a white male English person who is a semi-plausible England manager.
Who is the only manager fit for post-Brexit England? It has to be Big Sam Allardyce.
The man who looks like a Neanderthal, but is actually quite a thoughtful figure, but who also believes in traditional English football with kind of power and muscle and long balls.
Tub-thumping Englishman who has managed a series of predominantly Northern English clubs. He's basically the guy that comes in the middle of the season to save you from relegation. This is Brexit football, humping it up to a striker at the top end of the pitch, winning 1-0, but also thinking that you're far better at your job than you actually are. And Big Sam has, he has pretensions to greatness. He talks a lot about how he's probably one of the goats of the game that's never given enough credit.
So they've succeeded. They found a white male
It can only be him.
Englishman. He lost one match. He does have a 100% record with England. I think they beat Slovakia in his only match. He's the only England manager with a 100% record. He is then secretly filmed talking about how you can subvert Football Association regulations on transfers. And so what now? The people in the frame include Steve Bruce,
Solid. He would have been a solid shout, yeah.
Eddie Howe and Alan Pardew. Not to be confused with Alan Partridge, the fictional talk show host. But in the end, the job goes to a guy who has never won a managerial trophy and whose last job ended in relegation. Gareth Southgate is the last Englishman on the shelf.
Wow. I think in the Brexit analogy, Gareth Southgate is a soft Remainer. I think Pards would have been hard leave, and so would all the others. Big Sam definitely, in the sort of Theresa May style. But we end up with a soft Remainer. And also somebody that's not going to attract scrutiny. So I think the FA are completely chastened by what's happened with Big Sam. It's a disaster.
And Southgate is decent. I mean, nobody thinks he's a good football manager at this point, but he's a decent
There is
bloke.
no shit you could dig up on this man that is even remotely salacious enough to attract any tabloid scrutiny.
Yeah, in tabloid eyes, he is boring.
He is whiter than white.
When Southgate becomes England manager, autumn 2016, it's the lowest point. And he gets to rethink the way England do things because nobody is happy with anything about the team. The players come terrified. They'd rather not play for England. Nobody believes England can win anything. And Southgate thinks, and he's thought about this for decades, the first thing he has to do is get rid of the absurd expectations that hang over the England team, that just because football was invented here in 1863, that therefore 150 years on, we should be winning every World Cup. And he says, look, when I played against teams like Brazil, they were just in better physical shape. They were more organised. Why would England expect to beat them?
And sort of this detoxification of the England team, which happens, which is something that Henry Winter, sports journalist, also speaks about during our episode with him. Check it out. Southgate is definitely spearheading this. And it's about internal cultural change. It's about expectation management from the outside. And he has 2 years before a major tournament to get a lot of this groundwork done. And he does it pretty well.
Yeah, they don't even really expect to qualify for the World Cup 2018. But I think he's taken on board, whether directly or indirectly, the argument from Soccernomics, a book I wrote with Stefan Szymanski, which is that if you look at where England should be, look at their population, the wealth of the country, which predicts football success, and how long they've been playing, you'd say, yeah, England should be about 10th best in the world. And you know what? Historically, they are about 10th best in the world, which is fine. It's not underperformance at all. England are about as good as you'd expect. So Southgate resets expectations to realism. When we go to a World Cup, don't ask if we can win it. What are you basing that on? We haven't won a knockout match at a major tournament since 2006, at the point when he takes over. So he says, look, don't load this ridiculous expectation on players. They shouldn't load it on themselves. So we are going to reform England in a very humble way. Now, he wants a high-performance culture, which doesn't mean, oh, we're going to be world champions. It means we are going to be the best team that we can possibly be. Every aspect of the organisation, from nutrition to tactical preparation to preparing for penalties for the first time, has to be 100%. And that makes players feel they're in a high-performance environment, because Southgate knows what a low-performance environment was, because he was there for 5 years, his best years at Aston Villa.
This is pretty easy to do with players who have high-performance environments in their domestic clubs. So around the time that Southgate takes over, this is when Klopp and Pep are coming into the Premier League. Chelsea win the Champions League in 2012. English clubs are some of the best in the world. So there's always just been this jarring disconnect between how players perform in their domestic environments, which are incredibly high performing, and then England, which just the bar seems to be far, far lower. And so I guess in that sense, he's really pushing out an open door.
Yeah. I mean, he's got these players who are also prepared in a much more continental way and trained in a more continental way. So you have players coming in like Phil Foden, later Jack Grealish, Raheem Sterling, who are wonderful footballers. And if you saw them in the Spain or the France team, you wouldn't be at all surprised. The kind of footballers England didn't produce in large numbers before.
And so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that they do pretty well in that tournament. I mean, they play pretty badly, or not in any remarkable sense, but they do get very, very far in the tournament. They get to the semi-finals.
Yeah, I mean, the 2018 World Cup, they're kind of very lucky because they beat Tunisia in extra time.
Bad teams, yeah. They play bad teams.
Yeah, but they play a not very good Tunisia, and they only win with a kind of goal in injury time. They beat Panama 6-1. You know, I think I could have beaten Panama 6-1. And then they lose to Belgium.
Who are better than them.
Who are better than them. Belgium beat them again later. They beat Colombia on penalties, which is a huge victory over kind of English history, because penalties. They beat Sweden, who are a pretty poor team. And then they lose to Croatia, which is where they kind of, the players get terrified by being in a World Cup semi-final, winning, because England always score in the first 5 minutes in big matches, they always do. And then the players think, oh, we're going to do this Dunkirk English defence where we defend in our own penalty box and we try and boot the ball clear for 90 minutes. So essentially, they spend nearly the entire match giving the ball back to Luka Modric. So predictably, Croatia wins.
And Croatia are better than them.
Well, England let Croatia be better. I mean, Croatia are a very beatable team.
As France showed in the final.
But Southgate is trying to teach England, we're going to play continental football. We have the ball, we pass it around. But at the supreme moment, World Cup semi, the players revert to their atavistic English instincts and they do this long ball football and Dunkirk defence.
They do that exactly again in the Euro 2020 final too.
They will do that again in the Euro 2020. So there's this kind of core of Englishness that is hard to root out. It's very weird because these guys play for Manchester City and Arsenal and Liverpool. They would never do that in a league game for their club. And they do it with England because the England shirt hangs so heavy. And this is something Southgate realised and is trying to bang out of them.
I mean, I would also say that that's also his limitation as a manager.
Possibly. But he's telling them...
Because tactically he can't force them to stick to what they know. Like he can't untrain those behaviours from them.
Possibly. I mean, I was watching Jordan Pickford in the Croatia match and Pickford is terrified. And normally Pickford is a good passer from the back, but he just doesn't want to take the risk of passing. So he blams the ball into midfield where half a second later it's at Luka Modric's feet again.
But generally the vibe of that tournament, you were obviously there, but from what I can see from the England fans, like football's coming home is hugely ironic. There's a lot of self-deprecation around. There's no expectations on the team, and they really benefit from the fact that anything they do is kind of an upside surprise. Yeah, every time they win, or it's something to be celebrated rather than, well, obviously we expect this because we need to go and get to the final. We need to win. Yeah,
so it's this turnaround. It's the moment when English fans learn to love
humble
England.
Themselves as well.
They're humble and they learn to love England because it's the time when I think the population learns to love a new kind of humbler team.
And they are new. These are lots of new faces.
New players.
These are young, very young English kids.
Maguire, Kane, Stones, Sterling. Yeah.
Loftus-Cheek plays in that tournament. Pickford is a relatively new goalkeeper.
Yeah.
they're easier to love. And I think there's a lot of rebuilding that happens in that summer and a lot of affection that is regained for that team, especially just me thinking of my friends who went out to Russia, probably would never be what you would consider classical England supporters, but they have a brilliant summer and the vibes are great around that team. And I think historically, if England lost in a semi-final to Croatia, the natural attitude is like, who the hell are Croatia? We should beat Croatia. Croatia is a nothing nation. But there isn't that kind of level of arrogance.
People say Croatia are just a better
they're a brilliant team, yeah.
I think what Southgate has done is he's performed a kind of reverse Brexit in the aftermath of Brexit. So Brexit is about Brexit is about we return to traditional Englishness.
Sure.
And, we have this manifest destiny to be this great country alone. And Southgate is saying, no, we are going to learn from the continentals. And we're going to play cold-headed, continental possession football. We're not going to do this kind of football is war thing and win it, lads, and get stuck in. He's an English moderniser like Tony Blair or Alf Ramsey, the England manager in '66, who was famous for his scientific management. And so Southgate is learning from the best teams in the world, having acknowledged that England is not one of the best teams in the world.
So I'm going to stick with he's not Tony Blair, he's actually John Major. And I think whoever's going to succeed Gareth Southgate, which could happen pretty soon, even after the summer's tournament, has the potential to be that Tony Blair kind of figure. And the reason that I don't think that he's this kind of trailblazing modernizer is because he's only doing and reflecting what is already happening around him. And he knows that his players are in high performance cultures at their domestic teams. He just needs to introduce a bit more of that to England. And he doesn't manage to achieve it because, as we've already mentioned, there is a limitation. And when they are 1-0 up early on in a big knockout game, they cannot sustain their playing style that has led them to that point of success. They sort of revert into this slightly more, antiquated sense of defend, play really deep under the pitch and invite pressure on team.
And hit long balls out of defence, clear it, lads, clear it. Yeah, looking like sort of English football.
Yeah, boot it up the pitch, which is Brexit football. Yeah. So he actually doesn't manage to, I think, untrain a lot of these habits, and that's why I think he's not as trailblazing as you might think.
No, I don't think that he's so much trailblazing, but he takes this kind of Premier League football and the existence of players like Foden and Kane, who are playing in some of the most sophisticated teams in the world and who've learned top-level international football, and says, okay, we are going to replicate England. It's going to become like a top club.
Yeah, it's mimicry.
But mimicry can be a really good thing.
Yeah, sure.
He brings in traditions in the England camp. So players used to hate going to England. They were at Manchester United and they were winning, and it was a high-performance environment where everybody was on their toes 24/7, and you usually won. And then you come to England, you usually lose the big games, and tabloids are slamming you, and players just didn't want to be there. And so he wants them to be there. So he says, look, you were part of something long and great. There's only about 1,200 people who've played for England since 1872. And when you give each one of them a number, the ones from 1872 retrospectively get a number. So you're walking in this long tradition. There's sports psychologists, which he wished he'd had after his penalty miss in '96. And he wants to make the England team a kind of calm and happy place, something he felt that Sven-Göran Eriksson did well. Now, the visual image of England in that tournament is Southgate on the touchline in his waistcoat. And never seen in a waistcoat before, it then becomes the style image of the England team, and he accepts it. He realised, people need someone who embodies the team. He becomes a figurehead.
Centrist dad chic.
You're not fond of the waistcoat?
I think he looks like a snooker player.
Is that a good thing?
No, I'm not a waistcoat kind of girl. But I appreciate the kind of iconic status that it's taken on, but it's not a vibe for me. Would you wear a waistcoat as a card-carrying member of the centrist dad club? I'm
not a centrist dad, I'm a liberal. I personally would not wear one, but one day that waistcoat will hang in the National Football Museum.
I'll give him his props. His suits are very well tailored, as you would expect. I'm sure the FA get him measured up properly. He's not wearing those, that baggy, the shirt that he missed a penalty in was like 5 sizes too big for him.
It would be weird if he was still wearing that 30 years on. So he takes England to Euro 2020. Many of the same players, now 3 years older, because Euro 2020 is actually played in 2021 because of the pandemic. But the world has moved on, especially with Black Lives Matter.
Yes, so in the summer before the tournament, in summer of 2020, the world is sort of roiled by the figure of George Floyd, who's killed brutally by police in the US, and it creates a movement, Black Lives Matter, which very quickly spreads from the US, definitely to some parts of Western Europe, and England and the UK is caught up in it. And quickly you have black athletes, footballers, racing drivers, cricketers who want to show solidarity with what's happened with George Floyd. And we have this phenomenon phenomena of taking the knee. So before matches in that season, 2020-2021 season, all players before Premier League matches take the knee. And this is sort of a historic symbol to show solidarity and the cause of racial justice.
But in 2021, this is very controversial because the British right and many of the ruling Conservative Party start to attack it. It's called woke, etc. And so it becomes a culture war. And Gareth Southgate, older white guy, he defends his team very vocally. And he says, look, I'm trying to learn what it means to be a young black man in England, to be discriminated against, to be at risk of police violence. And I think you should all try and put yourself in their shoes and try and empathize. This is a country where the England manager had never, in my experience, taken a stance on any social issue. And Southgate says, no, I'm going to talk about society.
And we should give the players their props here, because I'm thinking back to what happened. And you have a series of kind of Tory politicians, and I think Liz Truss and even Boris Johnson sort of coming out on Twitter saying, football is not about politics. Let's keep the politics out of it. And then you have figures, Tyrone Mings, the Aston Villa defender, who really comes out hard against these politicians and sort of points the finger at them, saying they've created a hostile environment where things like Black Lives Matter have taken on a political significance that they don't deserve. Marcus Rashford also becomes very prominent in the summer of COVID because he is the footballer that is effectively paying for kids to keep having free school dinners after the government cuts funding.
He becomes a major political figure. He fights the government over free school meals.
And he becomes a lightning rod for Tories, as Henry Winter also mentions in our episode with him. So I think we have to give the players their due. And in some senses, Southgate is following their lead.
And Southgate, I think, is important, though, in that he starts to express a new kind of idea of Englishness. And he writes this Dear England letter he publishes on Players Tribune, where he talks about this idea of Englishness that encompasses everyone. So he talks about his granddad, who was a war veteran in the Southgate family. This is very important. So that's the kind of traditional Englishness. But he says, look, people of all colours, these young players, often of African origin, they're also part of Englishness. And we're all in this together. And he dares to say that there was a racist tinge to some of the Brexit debate. And it matters because, look, the point of a national football team is to embody the nation, to be the nation. So when you see the 11 players of your national team lined up, at that moment, they are the nation made flesh. They're more kind of general than the king. They're more alive than the flag. So when you see England play or France or Germany, you're seeing the nation come into a kind of physical being at that point. And so it really matters, what is the nation? What is England? And Southgate says England is all of us. England is old white guys like me and young black people like the players in my team.
I agree. I give him some props for it, but I just don't think he deserves so many flowers for not being a racist.
It's not just not being a racist. He's coming out and expressing this, knowing a lot of people are not going to like it.
I agree, but I still think that he's more derivative of the things that are happening in England. So the country has changed remarkably in the 20 years, 30 years that Southgate is in professional football. And he sees that, and I think it's commendable that he does reflect that in this kind of very civil and sane way of trying to intervene in these quite toxic debates. I think he does stand up as somebody that has quite a strong moral compass when the country is sort of, having a nervous breakdown around culture wars and the rest of it. But for me, if I'm going to give the flowers, I think it has to be given to the players, more so than Southgate.
Marcus Rashford above all, but who else would you?
Rashford, Sterling is subject to horrific levels of sort of kind of tabloid abuse about his private life, about the fact that he got married young and he was a young father, and the fact that he's materialistic, that he lives in a big mansion and he doesn't really care about the country. So, black or mixed race England players always have this sense in which they're just not, they don't wrap themselves in the flag and they do not identify with this country as much as someone like a Phil Foden would do, right? So Foden and Sterling both break through in very similar ages. They play in similar positions. Foden, you can just look back and think of the media treatment that he gets. It's just nowhere near as vitriolic as what Sterling is subjected to. And I think the players take a lot of this burden on, and Black Lives Matter is somewhere where they're allowed to express and speak in quite candid terms about what they've suffered. And I think it's highly commendable that Gareth encourages that and also protects them. But if I'm going to give due to how England and the brand has changed. I think the players have done way, way more than the FA, who've done well to, I think, cultivate and allow them the safe space to do this. But I'm going to give way more of my praise to the kids that wear that shirt rather than the management above them.
I think the significance of the manager in England is that traditionally in English football, players barely speak and the manager does. And Southgate said he realised quite early on in the job that the England manager press conference is an event in itself. It's almost as important as a game. So what an England manager says at a press conference is broadcast around the world. There will be literally hundreds of journalists. So he has a podium which is comparable to the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition. And Southgate, I mean, you say that this new Englishness had taken form already, yes, but nobody in politics has expressed it as well as Southgate has. I would wish that Keir Starmer would make a speech as eloquent as that about Englishness, but he hasn't.
No, and he won't.
And the Tories just bash or cast aspersions on this idea of an Englishness that includes people from non-traditional backgrounds.
Yeah. I mean, we are talking a lot about the kind of the meta parts of what Gareth Southgate represents, but for fans, really, it's about what happens on the pitch.
And England at Euro 2020 do very well. They have their best tournament since 1966. So they get to the final, having conceded only one goal, and they've beaten Germany quite comfortably along the way. So the final against Italy at Wembley, it's exactly 25 years on, almost to the week of Southgate's miss against Germany. And it's a disappointment. Italy are what England are trying to be. They're a team that can keep the ball and control the game.
And they're also a team that just knows that when you get to the final, they usually win. They just know how to play the final.
And England are panicked by a final. But still, you know, England are pushed back. They're not as stupid as against Croatia in 2018. They are the weaker team, but they get to penalties at 1-1. And then, of course, they lose on penalties because they always lose on penalties. And this time, the villains are three young black men.
Mm-hmm. Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, and Bukayo Saka, the youngest of them all.
And they get a lot of racist abuse, horrendous stuff on social media. And Southgate gets behind them. And I think most of the population actually gets behind them because you can always take, you know, the few thousand people who send racist remarks on social media and say, look at how the English are reacting. But of course, this is a tiny subset. I would say that most people are with Rashford, Sancho and Saka, which is not to say they didn't take horrendous abuse from cretins, but they also get past it, which I think is a tribute to them. I think when they missed the penalties, of course, he saw himself at that same ground 25 years ago missing the penalty, and nobody comforts him except John Major. And there's no psychological support, and he has to deal with it himself over subsequent years, and he's determined that's not going to happen to these three players.
There are also other parallels which don't put him in a great light, and one of them is the criticism that all of these three guys come on as substitutes quite late on in the game. So their first major act in the match is to take the penalty. And that kind of reflects a bit like how Gareth was also completely unprepared for his own penalty because he'd never taken them.
Yeah,
so he probably feels some guilt.
Yes, and maybe you should say, well, we had him on the list. We had Rashford on the list. And we decided beforehand who was on the list. But seeing that he only played a few minutes, we should have taken him off the list. That is something you could reflect on. On the other hand, I mean, at least they had a list. At least they had a plan. At least they practiced the penalties. I mean, you look at the Italian goal, and in it is Gianluigi Donnarumma,
huge,
the biggest person in the world, this ogre-like figure.
Yeah. He looks about 40, he's about 22.
Yeah, he's extremely young, looks old, brilliant goalkeeper at that point. I mean, he doesn't actually develop that well afterwards, but he's the last person in the world you would want to take a penalty against in the final in 2021. So what happens with Donnarumma in his prime is that people would miss because they would think, well, I have to put it right in the corner because otherwise he's going to get it. And so that's what I think happens to a couple of the England players.
And then Bonucci looks down, stares into the camera and screams, "Football's coming, Rome!" And so in that moment when he's comforting Sancho, Rashford and Saka, he becomes the John Major figure because nobody else puts their arm around them at that point. It's him on the pitch with them.
Well, Major in 1996 is this 50-something decent South Londoner at Wembley, and that becomes Gareth Southgate. Yeah, so he is morphed into John Major.
Is Boris Johnson in the stadium?
Most likely saw it as an opportunity to spread some more COVID with a party.
So, now we're at the World Cup 2022, which is the second World Cup that Gareth Southgate is going to be England manager. And now, I think for the first time, there is a lot of expectation on this side. They got close against Italy in the Euro 2020 final, And now you look around this team and it is stacked full of some of the world's best footballing talent. Foden doesn't really have a great 2020 tournament, but by the time 2022 is coming around, he's seen to be the heir to Gaza. Harry Kane is probably the best striker in the world, along with Mbappe and perhaps Benzema. There's now huge hopes on this. Again, another golden generation of English football talent.
Yeah, a lot of them playing their third tournament, plus Jude Bellingham, listen to our podcast. And if you look at that 2018 team, I mean, Jesse Lingard was in the team.
Yeah, there were a couple of journeymen in that side.
Yeah, it was not of the quality of 2022.
But now you look at, probably for every position, they have two very, very good players. This is the season where Declan Rice is becoming one of the best midfielders in the world. Then you have the kind of England stalwarts like Calvin Phillips and Henderson, who are really reliable, Mason Mount, Pickford in goal, John Stones, Kyle Walker. These guys are winning Champions Leagues and leagues every summer, right?
So now Southgate has a kind of responsibility, which he didn't have in 2018, that he has a golden generation in his hands and he must not squander this.
And the rest of the world, they know that England are
decent team.
super good on paper.
I mean, I was in Qatar, everyone who wasn't English was rubbing their hands, waiting for the inevitable England elimination where they would all burst out laughing. And it happens because England do really well. They're very professional, in control. And then they play France, wonderful team.
Tchouameni's goal.
France win a very closely contested top-level game that could have been a World Cup final, 2-1.
All of the previous failures come back to light. The sense of declinism then attaches itself to this squad.
Except they were highly competent and professional and they lost to a really good team in a good match.
But nobody thinks about it like that.
Really? I thought
England.
about it like that.
Yeah, and it was probably because you're not an England fan.
Yeah.
I'm sort of, reflecting how I sort of saw the discourse in this country play out. And I think that's also the tournament where people just think Southgate is not the guy that is going to get us past that hurdle of a quarterfinal or a semi-final. That yes, he's brilliant at doing a lot of the other things. He's been a great stabilising force. But to take this team to the next level and to give this golden generation the mandate they deserve, he has to go. And I think this summer, he's basically on his last chance.
Yeah, we come to legacy, and his legacy will depend on what happens at the Euros. So England still have a wonderful team. France are not as strong as they were 2 years ago.
Germany, you just don't know whether they're going to be awful or really, really good.
So it's unpredictable whether England will win, but they definitely have a serious shot at winning. Most people would say they're one of the three best teams in Europe. So if they win, then Southgate's legacy is he is the man who, after nearly 60 years, slayed the demon.
He's not John Major. He might actually then become Tony Blair.
Blair without Iraq.
I think the irony of everything that we've spoken about the other parts of what Southgateism is, ultimately he will be judged as all previous England managers are. And that's basically what he does in terms of big tournaments. I think a lot of the other stuff we've spoken about is a nice to have and will be seen as like, well, he did lots of good things, but that's kind of something that maybe a director of football can do. When you're the manager, you just got to win.
I don't know. I think, so if they go out in the quarterfinal at the Euro,
I think
Southgate
he will go
leave.
down as squandering another golden generation of English talent.
Southgate will leave and people will be disappointed. But they'll say, look, he got to the final and lost on penalties at the Euro, got to a World Cup semi, better than anyone else since 1966. And he was a good bloke. I think that counts for something, I think that in the end, he will be able to go on to a happy afterlife.
Is what big English Premier League team would appoint Gareth Southgate as their manager?
Manchester United
Top
might.
6? No, don't see it. I think he's a director of football.
Okay, but he might not get the top jobs, and almost nobody did after being England manager. Almost always their career went into a downhill spin. But I think he will emerge respected and undamaged, that he won't become this kind of figure of fun or hatred.
I think right now he's at danger of becoming a bit of a figure of fun because he doesn't really know what to do with the immense talent that he has at his hands. I think England fans have run out of patience, and this summer will probably be his last tournament, whether they win it or not. I think, again, like Major, I think posterity will be very kind to him. We'll look back and say he was an excellent stabilising force. His biggest legacy, I think, is sort of detoxifying the English brand. There's a lot to be said for that. But if it doesn't come with the results in the big tournaments, I think he will be seen as just as deficient as the managers who had more talent than him as managers, who also didn't manage to get the Holy Grail, so the Capellos of this world, the Venables of this world.
Well, I think we have to detach two things. So Southgate, the manager, I don't think there's any evidence that he's a great manager.
No.
And there wasn't when he was appointed. And I think people will say that, and he's been a competent manager. And England are now they're not the 10th best team in the world. They're probably the 5th or 6th best team in the world. They're a really good team, and they haven't won the big prizes, maybe not quite good enough for that. He's not a great manager, but I think we will say he was a good man. I think there's very few people who would deny that, not even you.
No,
And
I think
that
the fact
matters.
that the two of us speak in more affectionate terms about England show
Yeah.
that his legacy or what he's achieved is pretty sizable.
Yeah, I now quite like England, and I usually sort of want them to win without being a fan.
Yeah.
And I also think that he's helped, and this sounds pompous, but it's true, he's helped redefine Englishness. So his vision of Englishness is, firstly, it's professional and humble. You measure yourself against global best practice. What are the French doing? What are the Spaniards doing? And we try and learn from that. We try and be as good as anyone else, but from a position of modesty. We're not the greatest nation. We shouldn't expect to win prizes, but we should expect to learn and compete at the top. And his England is also an inclusive and a kind England. It includes people of all colours and all sexual identities. So around the World Cup in Qatar, England is one of the countries making statements in favour of LGBTQ rights. So it's an inclusive England, but it's also, so it has a place for everyone, for the trans kid, for the young black footballer, but it also is a traditional England where a man stands up when a woman walks into the room, where you sing the national anthem, where you honour veterans like his grandfather. And I think that mix of tradition and modernity has to be essential to Englishness.
If that is a political scale, I'm further in the progressive side.
Yes.
And I probably would think you'd have to be much more full-throated in your defence of a lot of the issues that we've spoken about, including race and including getting involved in things that are seen to be in the political realm. I think he's taken a relatively safe line. It's the middle way, the centrist path. If I really want to think about this England team representing someone like me, I would expect them to be a bit more forthright and forceful.
What would you want him to say?
I would expect him to condemn politicians when they attack the team. I think that LGBTI flag incident, England basically stayed silent and allowed the politicians to decide what they were going to do, and effectively they gave in. If they were really going to have the courage of their convictions, they should have come out and said, we are doing this for a reason and here's the reason, and if you don't like it, then lump it. They didn't do that. I still think that there is this soft underbelly that when they come under pressure, that they probably will fold to public pressure and to tabloid pressure. And so I'm not ready to give them that award yet of being, morally upstanding and having the courage of their convictions. I still think that the FA ultimately will succumb.
Yeah,
And
I think
so-
the FA sees itself as an arm of government, and it's not supposed to speak against government.
It's a British institution, and so I think he's done well to immunise a lot of the players from some of the dirtier and nastier stuff that's come out at them. But I don't think for me it's been necessary but insufficient.
I hear you, and I would agree with a lot of that. I think what we're seeing is a visualization of how a lot of companies and workplaces work, in that typically the leader is a white man in his 50s. And the staff are younger and more diverse, which is how the England setup works. So a lot depends on how the leader reacts to things that come along, like in this case, taking the knee. And the leader thinks, well, in my day, nobody took the knee, so I'm against this. Or the leader thinks, hang on, what was done in my day was often bad and retrograde. And I want to hear these 22-year-olds and let them tell me what they feel about taking the knee. And to me, that's good leadership, that you can step out of yourself and hear somebody whose life experience is different and take that on board. And I think that just as he learned that his attitude to mental health was retrograde, having dealt badly with Stan Collymore, I think he's learned that he didn't understand race, and he's learning from his black players about how racism works in Britain.
It's a bit like this podcast. He's confronted with an ethnic who has to teach him about the realities of the world.
We're both ethnics.
I'm Jadon Sancho and you're Gareth Southgate. But we usually, Simon, end the podcast asking a couple of things. One of them is what our figure would be doing if they weren't in football.
He would be a journalist.
You reckon?
Yeah, he wanted to be a journalist. He then wrote this book in 2004. He co-wrote it with David Walsh. He's a very good sports writer. And then he worked for ITV, when he was out of management.
So we think he'd be
a
print journalist rather than a broadcaster?
Yeah, I think he would like to be the Michael Atherton of football, writing kind of reflective things on developments inside the game, yeah.
And you've already hung out with him, but given the chance to do so again, maybe you could do a repeat body fat test if you met Southgate today? He's probably still 9%.
He's probably still 9%. I'm
You're
32% now, double from what I was. I don't know. That's my estimate.
I think you would get along very well. I think if I was confronted by two versions of you, it'd probably be a bit too much.
You don't want to see him?
No, I'm all right.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms.
Next week's episode is on Lionel Messi and how after 20 years, Argentinians finally came to love the greatest player of all time. Be sure to check it out.
This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.